but shock a lot of people that still do not realize what communists are capable to do. When we were following all the numbers and the results and the official website of the Supreme Court, we saw something stopped being kind of being frozen from the 66.66%. And that moment.
You're talking about the total number of ballots counted? Where does that number come from?
Yeah.
So they stopped it at 66.6. They stopped the counting.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
my
they
gosh.
stopped. That got frozen. And then Lula started to have more votes than Bolsonaro. And not just few votes, 7 million votes. But the problem is, if you see the streets, all the videos, it's viral on the internet, you can see that clearly Lula couldn't bring anyone to the street for the rallies, for anything. And when you see Bolsonaro, even place that Bolsonaro wasn't able to go, was way more packed, and the crowd was bigger.
So it's a lot like what we saw in America. Trump, 20, 30,000 people every rally. Biden, 300 max. We saw virtually the same thing with Bolsonaro and Lula.
Welcome to the Convo Couch, everybody. Pastor Jardula is here. I have some guests for you guys today. I want to make sure that you can hear me loud and clear. Thank you, everybody who's joining us. Fiorella is here, and we have a guest. We brought him right in. Danny Shaw. How you doing today, Danny?
Good to see everybody. Important topics here to discuss and break down.
Yep. So let me get you on the big screen because we have a lot of things to discuss. We saw that video right over there. He said right out of the gate that there was a flipping almost of votes where Bolsonaro had a huge lead, and try to compare it with what was going on in 2020 where Trump had a huge lead and then eventually lost. The only problem is, he says, ballots. There are no ballots in the Brazil election. I think we should mention that right off the top. But the thing he said that was just so crazy, and I want you to dive right into this, Danny, is the fact that he said that Bolsonaro had these huge events and Lula couldn't have hardly anybody at his events. Why don't we talk about the September 7th event that you went to, in which they keep showing pictures of, and they keep on saying that Bolsonaro had this huge event. What was that day, and what was really going on?
September 7th is the July 4th of the Brazilian people. It was the bicentennial this year of their independence. I would put independence in quotation marks, because who can truly make an argument that diplomatically, economically, and beyond, Brazil is a truly independent country, and that's almost regardless of whether Bolsonaro or Lula wins, though certainly Lula is a path back towards some sense of self-determination. So what Bolsonaro was able to do with his base, and he certainly does have a base, reminds me of that quote by the African Cape Verdean revolutionary Amilcar Cabral: count no easy victories, tell the people no lies. There were tens of thousands in the streets of Brasilia, of Rio de Janeiro, two of Bolsonaro's base cities. But Lula, not just on September 7th, but in the build-up to this election, the PT, Lula, Fernando Haddad, they brought how many tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of the Northeast, of Sao Paulo, of Curitiba in the South. So when you listen to InfoWars and Alex Jones, I don't hear any evidence-based sharing. It's just based on an ideological viewpoint, and they've already decided what their conclusions are.
Yeah. Fiorella, you got anything for that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are a lot of Bolsonaro supporters in those areas that you mentioned. We've seen them as well. There was also, of course, the Brazilian, the hijacking of the Brazilian flag and stuff. But you ran into some of these patriots as well. What was your experience with them, and why do you think that there was so much support from the right in the United States, with Steve Bannon even making his way there in Brazil?
Yeah, I was there in Copacabana on September 7th, and what Bolsonaro was able to do was hijack this Independence Day and merge it into his rally. So it was a sea of yellow and green in Copacabana. Global estimated 60,000 to 65,000 actual supporters. It was definitely, significant numbers out there. Because I'm from New York and I speak English and they didn't recognize me, my profile in Brazil was low enough. They actually invited me up onto some of the Bolsonarista floats. I didn't speak any Portuguese. I just led on like I was a everyday tourist or American academic. And I bumped into the Jason Millers and these other senior Trump strategists. And yes, Steve Bannon was down there as well at the beginning of September. So it's very telling that Steve Bannon would say this is the most important election on earth, or the second most important election. Now, in terms of the hijacking of the Brazilian flag, very similar to here in the United States, where Trumpism has done the very same. So that was an interesting conversation with the Brazilian people in terms of redeeming that flag and recapturing it for everyday people.
So a lot of people will say in the States that Bolsonaro will get a lot of support because of his stances on the vaccine. But obviously, when we go down there, there's not a lot of people who are as concerned about the vaccine as they are concerned about getting food in their refrigerator, getting milk on their table, getting a house over their head. Why do people in Brazil, and who are they? Why do they support Lula? Because, InfoWars and a lot of other networks are trying to make it out like Lula is this criminal, even though he was acquitted of all charges. They're trying to also make it seem like he doesn't have anybody at their rallies and events. And you just talked about how they had so many people in the streets. But why exactly do the people in Brazil, who are they that support Lula?
Yeah, and if anyone has any doubts about the massive PT rallies, not just now, but from 2011, when the InfoWars is the perfect name for Alex Jones' show, because it is an informational war, and it's been a communicational war and a media war against Lula. Look where Lula comes from. Lula represents the real Brazil, the Brazil of the 95% or 99%, the campesinos, the everyday workers. He himself was a factory worker. When you hear his speeches, he's always talking about how much he struggled with his 7 siblings and his single mother, and his father wasn't there present. So he has this emotional connection with everyday Brazilians versus Bolsonaro's very dry, militaristic, I think arrogant, presumptuous style. Lula speaks the language of everyday people. Go on Calçachun News. You can go on my Twitter. You can scroll back to the early days of September to see these massive rallies, but no one's, the right-wing media, the pro-imperialist media, they're not going to cover this because they have but one viewpoint, regardless of what's playing out every day. In terms of the economic warfare on the Brazilian people, all Lula is saying, and I don't know why this is so radical, it's the same thing Jean-Bertrand Aristide was saying in Haiti. If our people can't eat, then we can't think consciously. So full bellies mean full social consciousness. And that's the program that Lula represents. To call that communist is ridiculous. At the same time, how many communists in history have said the people have a right to eat 3 times a day?
Yeah. So, Fee, can I follow up on it real quick? I just wanted to, because we did kind of explain why Americans and people in the West like Bolsonaro. We just, we know those reasons, Bannon, the whole 9 yards. But he did get 55 million votes, or was it close to 53 million votes, Bolsonaro? Why in the people in Brazil, why are there some people voting him when there's such civil unrest? I mean, people are in the streets. Homeless is just craziness. We all got, I'm 2 of the 3 people on this show right here got the phone stolen. I mean, why are people still supporting Bolsonaro? Did you lose me?
That's for Fiorella or for me?
No, for you, Danny. Yeah.
I was waiting for Fiorella to come with that knockout punch. My bad.
My bad.
This informational war on Lula, as though he's the most corrupt individual in history. This is hatred of any worker. Lula talks a lot about For the first time, the true rulers of Brazilian destiny, who thought they were so impenetrable and invincible, they saw indigenous people and black people go to a university, and poor people could actually take a plane ticket to Recife or Fortaleza in the north, and poor people could go on vacation for the first time after 2003. So for the first time, there were these socio-economic benefits for everyday Brazilian people. And I think that's what the military brass and the wealthy congressmen who come from the upper echelons of Brazilian society, that's why they can't forgive the PT. The base of the PT is Ucuti, the largest trade union in the history of Latin America, the 5th largest trade union in all of the world, the CUT. And you have the MST, 1.6 million members of the landless farmers workers movement. Landless workers movement would be the translation. So you're talking about these massive social movements which have created this alliance. They've had to also be with this centrist vice presidential candidate, Geraldo Alckmin. So Lula's had to make so many concessions. So even if Lula was this radical, within the context of this campaign and the lawfare campaign against the PT and the Brazilian left, Lula's more to the center than ever. So to keep calling him this rhetoric of the InfoWars, to call him a communist, it's absolute malarkey.
Pam?
Yeah. And so, you know, we were all there. We all spoke to people in the MST. We have talked to several people that were on the ground. The narrative is different. There's a lot of people here in the United States on the left pushing this idea that Lula is just like Biden, that Lula supporters are all just this monolithic group of liberals, when in reality, as you mentioned, Lula is reaching out towards different sectors. You have everybody from a communist to a liberal at times supporting Lula. Why do you think so many people that were once the, you know, the petty bourgeois, that were once, you know, these small business owners, that were once on the other end of the spectrum, went and decided to support Lula this time around?
I think COVID was one issue that played out. More than half a million Brazilians died, including a close aunt figure of mine. I've been studying Brazilian Portuguese since 2003. I have ethnographic training. I've lived in, when I talk about these different communities in Rio de Janeiro and in the Northeast, I've spent considerable time there. I've lived there. And Bolsonaro, you know, he's very similar to a very divisive, polarizing Trump figure. He comes out of the military. He comes from a powerful family background. His 4 children have powerful positions. It's an extremely polarized society. But a good chunk of the media, including the liberal media that's now, well, the Estado de Sao Paulo, one of the leading newspapers in Sao Paulo, they came out with an editorial on October 3rd, as we were still recovering from being robbed the night before. And they said that they wouldn't support either of these candidates. So the ruling class has been split in a sense and has, I think, vilified both candidates. But it's a very polarizing situation. I mean, a Bolsonaro victory would mean more social neglect. How many businesses have shut down, small businesses in Brazil? There's a social upheaval. When you walk through downtown Sao Paulo, when you walk through downtown Rio, the homelessness, the crack epidemic. Now, a lot of that's pushed out of the favelas because the favelas have their own laws. You get caught any type of petty theft in the favelas, you're going to be uma micro-onda. That means they put a tire on you with gasoline, they light you on fire. I've known people who've gone through that type of thing. Obviously, they're not with us anymore. So they say Cracolândia, or the essence of the crack epidemic in Sao Paulo, it's been spread out because the police came and Bolsonaro's allied to the police state apparatus, and all these militias, these militias who are also connected to the evangelical church, the base of Bolsonaro's vote. And they've cracked down on many of these addicts, traumatized families who've been pushed into a homelessness situation in the center of Sao Paulo and Rio, which creates this horrific crime epidemic, which has resulted in more and more people blaming Bolsonaro. And it's these very simple bread and butter issues that have pushed them further to the left into Lula's camp.
Danny, you talked to a lot of people in labor and labor movements in Brazil and whatnot. Fiorella said something amazing the other day. I think I haven't stopped using it. And, you know, Bolsonaro was looked upon as the West, as this guy who's taking on the WHO and telling them to go scratch, and he's going to take on power, and he's fighting against the globalist. However, the argument has been, and from the people we've talked to from the MST, have said that Bolsonaro has let all these multinational corporations come in and steal agriculture. If you're going to stand up for the farmer in the Netherlands, then you can't condone, you can't allow what what he's doing in Brazil to go unchecked. Can you give a little bit more context to that, as far as these big corporations coming in and taking all away the small farmer and the indigenous owner?
Yeah, I think one could make an empirical argument that Brazil is arguably one of, or the richest country on earth. The lungs of South America, of the hemisphere, flow through the Amazon. We're talking about 1/3 of all South American land and resources. We're talking about 210 million people, 115 million of whom have African roots, the largest African population outside of Nigeria. So we're talking about an incredible economic powerhouse, right up there with Russia and China and some of the other largest economies on earth. I think Brazil's GDP is over $2 trillion. It's the 10th largest economy in the world. So there's a lot at stake here. Bolsonaro represents Washington and Miami and Wall Street's man in Brasilia. He's a con man. He's someone that they've pivoted towards because he's opened up the veins of Brazil, to cite a book that we should all study, Eduardo Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America, 5 Centuries of the Pillage of a Continent. So it's not hyperbole to say that Brazil, like the Congo and like these other huge pieces of the international chessboard, is vitally important to U.S. capital and Dutch capital and French capital. And a Lula victory means that they're going to have all types of new barriers. Not that Lula's not going to play ball. Lula is nowhere close to the Venezuelan leadership or the Cuban leadership in terms of how radically anti-imperialist they are. But certainly Lula represents an impediment to their snatching and pillaging the open veins of Brazil.
Bam.
Well, I guess my last question on this whole issue to you, Danny, is why do you think Lula will win on the next round? Do you think that Lula will actually surpass? Because a lot of people saw this as a loss for the PT, for Lula's party, because they expected him to take it on the first round. A lot of us that have been following this closely did not expect him to take it on the first round. But of course, still Bolsonaro's numbers were greater than some would have liked, especially obviously on Lula's end. What do you think is going to be necessary to take Lula over the top, and do you think he will take it?
We were at different watching parties on Sunday evening. It seems like months ago, but it was just this very week, and it was like watching an incredible Game 7 of the NBA Finals, and you were rooting, whether you were rooting for the Celtics or the Warriors. It was like, can Lula do it? 47%, but 85% of the vote has been counted. He's at 48.5%, but 98% of the vote is counted, and he was this close. What needs to happen in the upcoming days is o Lula tem que fechar com o MPB. Lula has to strike agreements with the more centrist parties, with these two different candidates who got between 4 to 8% of the vote. I mean, Lula won by over 6.5 million votes. It's certainly not a landslide, but it's a comfortable victory. Of course, the Alex Joneses and the Foxes would immediately say that this election was legitimate if their man had come out on top. But because their man lost, suddenly all evidence goes to the side, and it's completely ideology over any empirical evidence. I think Lula will win on October 30th because of this big alliance. The PT has looked to the left. They have the different revolutionary organizations, some of which we've mentioned. We haven't mentioned the PC do Bem. I mean, the Brazilian Communist Party has like hundreds of thousands of members. We don't have anything like that here in the United States. We did in the 1930s at the height of the Great Depression with the CPUSA, but it's very different today. I think Bolsonaro's in a lot of trouble. I think these candidates who were the third and fourth place candidates will get behind Lula. I don't think it'll be an easy victory on October 30th, but I think the PT will be back in power. And then the real battle begins because the Bolsonaristas won how many governorships, how many seats in Congress. They control a lot of the media, and the media that is not extreme right is not on the side of the PTs. So Global, with their new woke capitalism, kind of the CNN, MSNBC merged together of Brazil, is still going to be taking on Lula and the PT, trying to make sure that they don't form this alliance with the Bolivarian countries. Lula's talked about the Sur, a South American currency that could unite South America. I mean, how amazing would that be? Because the US dollar right now is at 5.3 reais, which is killing the Brazilians, to see their currency devalued every day. And the purchasing power of most Brazilians, I'll just end with this before throwing it back to y'all, but so many of my close people from the favelas, the most oppressed communities, had to come out and actually campaign because they would be paid the equivalent of $60 for every 15 days. And they would have to campaign for Bolsonaro or Bolsonarista candidates to try to put food on the table. And if they were found out to be from the PT, they would be censored and then they wouldn't be paid. Again, evidence of how polarized Brazil is.
Danny, thank you so much for that insight. And I just want to say, you know, we break down the technical part of it. This was not a rigged election. If there's any place vulnerable in this election, it could be within the machines. But from everything we saw from the opening to the close, there's a reason why Bolsonaro's reports were reported early. He was in the more affluent areas, so those numbers were going to be reported first. The areas that were a little bit more poor and impoverished, they had a little bit more time, longer time to get their process done. But there's no such thing as a ballot in Brazil, so that's a lie right off the bat. And that's why we wanted to bring Danny in today to kind of dispel this myth of what was going on as far as trying to make this parallel that, you know, just like Trump, Bolsonaro was this huge figure who filled up all these rallies in the streets and everything, and Lula was like Biden. Not at all. Lula is very much like Bernie Sanders. Like I said, he is a labor guy coming from labor. Obviously, Lula's got a little bit more skin in the game and had 2 terms as a president. But the lie that Lula can't get people in the streets and the lie that Lula is not the favorite had to be dispelled. And that's why we wanted to bring Danny on to talk about, to dispel that method. But if you want to know more about the math, Faminize last show, we talked about it. I was on a show with Burmis. That's coming out. We have a lot of the math to show you with the election system that this was not rigged. And I will say the same thing to the Bolsonaro supporter that I said to the Colombia supporter after they made it to the second round. Petro was suspected to wrap it up. A lot of people from Colombia were depressed and upset. He's not getting to the second round. He's now vulnerable. Hey, you got 3 weeks to go out and win an election. Go out and win an election. Stop bitching and crying about the system, especially Bolsonaro people who won on that system, and he won big before. And nothing was changed. So we don't want to hear it. You want to win, go to the streets and win and go prove it. But don't try to make this myth that Lula is something small like a Biden. He's huge, and people are starving in Brazil, and that's why they're supporting him in Brazil. Danny.
And we met with the TSE. You know, we met with the TSE. We met with the Superior Electoral Tribunal. We asked every question. You all's questions were extremely engaging and critical. I mean, we had them like up against the ropes. So it's funny, this system was, you know, well functioning when Bolsonaro won in 2018 by 10% over Fernando Haddad, at a moment where the lawfare campaign, similar to what they did to Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and that was the campaign against Dilma Rousseff and Lula in Brazil. And it came from these quote unquote liberal outlets as much as the right wing. But be careful, you know, they reaped this storm that was Bolsonarismo. And now a lot of the liberal ruling class media has turned on Bolsonaro. And of course, that's pivotal in terms of Lula coming back into power.
Yeah. And I just want to end real quick with,
I just wanted to get you in the big screen. Sorry about that.
Oh, and I just want to end real quick with the fact that not only were we there, we actually watched the entire process. We actually saw how clean it was in terms of, obviously we talk about paper ballots. We like paper ballots, but with the tally sheets, you could know right away who was the winner in the particular room in the polling center. And as Pasta said, the wealthier neighborhood that we were in, that the polling center we went to was completely different than the one we went to near the favelas and near the more working class areas of Brazil. And so when people say that this election wasn't fair, I will be the first one to call out an election when it's not fair. But the fact is, this system, the same election system, has been in place for 10 years. And there were no complaints previously, as Danny mentioned. And now all of a sudden, there's some sort of attempt to invalidate this election. And, when we were in Nicaragua, we were telling people this election was fair and the West was trying to invalidate it. And I think, what we're seeing here is that the United States is going to play their cards with Lula this time around. They're going to see what he does. And again, and if he takes this, of course, and I think he will, and they're watching him, right? This is going to be a kind of position where somebody like Petro's in, somebody like Castillo and Lula, they're basically watching to see, they're trying to work with Latin America, but they also have to be careful about the United States, because all of these countries have had a close relationship with the United States and have had neoliberal governments where people have had a hard time accepting communism as a whole. And so or any sort of leftist movement. And make no mistake that Lula is a progressive. He is not anything, super left at all. And I think, whatever Brazil decides, if Brazil decides this guy is going to help them, will be. And that's what should be respected at the end of the day, the sovereignty of Brazilians.
Danny, you want to add anything on that? Because I just want to say one last thing too about this, unless you got something to say.
Yeah, I think some Brazilians, just like here in the Bronx and across the U.S., they feel so disenfranchised. There's so much generational and historical trauma that plays out, whether it's through petty theft or crack addiction, and they don't feel invested in the system. And how do these organizations, these mass organizations, galvanize them and mobilize them to vote? That's been certainly a challenge in some areas of the country. Bolsonaro has that base in the South, and the votes in the South. The South of Brazil is historically settled by Italian, German, Portuguese, and Polish settlers and immigrants from the time of World War I and on. The Northeast is the most historically exploited area of Brazil, and those votes came in last. So this whole Alex Jones 66.66%, it couldn't have been 66.7, right? So not only are they communists, but they're also demonic, apparently. Nothing but
demonic communist. That's the worst.
That's the term we've been looking for all these years. So that's nothing but rhetoric, and it doesn't add up with those of us who've lived in Brazil. Shout out to Brazil Wire, Calçuchon News, and you all who for so many years now, Brazil Wire in particular, for I don't know how many years and decades, have been bringing this expertise to a English-speaking audience on Brazil.
Yeah, you know what? Thank you so much. And we come to provide the math about elections because we believe the quickest way to and the fairest way to national sovereignty is with free, fair, and transparent elections. That's the way that people get the power back. And correct me if I'm wrong, because a lot of people, because I've been saying that what I discovered from being on the ground over there is when we talk to these Uber drivers, these cab drivers, they like Bolsonaro, right? And I remember that interview with Glenn Greenwald and Lula when Lula said, like, yeah, when all these indigenous poor people eventually got to the airport where they could take a vacation, they were looked upon by the working class or the owner classes disgusting. And, oh, my God, how can you do this? And I do see this split between the peasants and the poor people and the working class there for some reason. It seems like that old traditional divide and conquer. But do you see that? And when I say that Lula's not a communist, but maybe he's a compromise between the communist and the capitalist, because he does divert some money and funds to the poorest of the poor. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that, like us here in the United States, we weren't born and raised into a socialist society. Ernesto Che Guevara talked about converting all of Cuban society into a gigantic school of socialism and love and collectivism. Well, it's the antithesis here in the United States and in Brazil. It's a gigantic school of capitalism, which pits us against one another. It's a racialized capitalism. It's Black Brazilians, indigenous Brazilians. It's the favelados who suffer the most. So that everyday Uber driver doesn't have years and years studying the Convo Couch or whatever alternative networks. They've been schooled by Globo. That's one of the richest families in all of Brazil, the Marinho family out of Rio de Janeiro. And Globo is truly, I think, dangerous. They control the entire cultural complex there. It's almost like merging CNN, MSNBC, and ABC together into one corporation. So people have been so thoroughly conditioned that we have to unpack how many decades and centuries of this colonial and neo-colonial indoctrination to understand the unsparing hatred that so many people feel towards a Lula who is really in the enemy's arena. How dare a worker who lost one of his fingers in a factory in Sao Bernardo in the south of Sao Paulo in the ABC factory district, how dare he stand up and speak truth to power on all of these powerful media monopolies platforms in the presidential debates. Lula is truly comes from o coração do povo, from the heart of the Brazilian people, and that's what they can't forgive.
Yeah, well, we got a lot of work to do. I got to tell you that much. But what we're not going to do is allow InfoWars or any of those people to tell these lies. And shame on the left establishment media for being so silent and not reporting the truth too as well. They're just as guilty for their silence, and we ain't going to let it slide.